Well, here we go. Yet another night of Star Trek stuff. And you know what? It's funny. When you're doing a thing, you start to notice where it is all around you. For the first time in ages, I've actually purchased Star Wars material. Now, in the 1980s, I couldn't go through a store without seeing something Star Trek related and wanting it. I had no money to buy anything, and I haven't really wanted to buy any Star Trek stuff for ages. So now, of course, I'm reading a Star Trek novel. I go to the grocery store and I see that Time has reissued its 50 years plus of the Final Frontier magazine. Now, I don't know when this was first published. It's obviously been updated for the last year or so. And I don't have any interest in reading this for all of y'all. This is just for my own sake. Star Trek novels is kind of where it was at. I came in that funny time when movies were coming out sometimes, when the TV series was in reruns that I didn't always have time to catch because I was a busy boy and it were on when I was busy doing other stuff as a kid. So books, that's where it was at, and I got a bunch of them. And the books are utterly ignored by this magazine. This is a TV series as far as they're concerned. Never mind the 30 or so Star Trek novels I have sitting on a shelf that I've never actually wanted to let go of. So there we go. That's it. That's the thing that they've got here. We've got from the early years, 1964, Desilu Studios tries to sell Star Trek to CBS. To 1967, McCoy says, "I'm a doctor, not a bricklayer." First variation of the phrase to 1967. At ratings peak, Star Trek ranks 52 behind lots of other shows that we've all forgotten about since then. Let's get that focus happening. There we go. Trouble with Tribbles in 67, 69. After 79 episodes, that's more episodes than Game of Thrones, according to this. Star Trek is canceled by NBC, not to come back again. The infamous, there's a book reference. He writes, "I am not Spock." The motion picture comes out, and that's about when the Star Trek novel started to happen. But although we mentioned the space shuttle, we never mentioned a single Star Trek novel that I'm aware of. So sad. So interesting, very TV-centric. I am seriously thinking about getting a CBS All Access subscription so I can watch the new stuff. I hear the animated series is a lot of fun for those that like, maybe Rick and Morty. It's a more adult-oriented cartoon, not the kiddie one. It's definitely not the animated series from the 1970s, or so I've been hearing. And I've been enjoying little clips of it that are available on YouTube. I don't want to waste too much time with the preamble to the main event, which is me putting myself to sleep by reading novels that I first read when I was 7. Chapter 11. Jim was beyond surprise. It was simply interesting now to find himself not in his command chair, but standing on a scrubby hillside that ran down on one side to a little gullied dry wash, and up on the other to a crest standing against blue sky. The sky was clear, and from the shade of blue, and the particular soft shadowless light that lay over everything, the time seemed to be just after sunset. "Well, let's get on with this," he thought, and began to climb. He passed manzanita bushes on the way up, and stands of feather duster grass, and a yucca plant with its tall flower spike just beginning to break out in creamy white bells. This could be anywhere in the southwest of N.A. Springs, or early summer. N.A. This could be anywhere in the southwest of N.A. I should know what N.A. is. And I can't think of it. This could be anywhere in the southwest of N.A. spring or early summer. The air is a bit cool. Jim made the hill crest, puffing. Should I be exerting myself so soon after cardiac arrest? Bones was right behind me, but I don't see him now. Can't ask him. Oh well. He looked down. The hillside fell away from him in broad, curved ridges for 1,000 feet or so. At its feet, spreading far ahead and to left and right for miles, lay a broad flat valley, thick with trees and crisscrossed with a webwork of golden lights in the dusk. Far across it, street lamps dotted the foothills of the Santa Monica's like a fall of stars, and the scream of commercial ion driver lifting from the suborbital port of Van Nuys drifted to him through the still air. On the far side of the Santa Monica's, a faint warm glow in the sky went up from the 10 million lights of Los Angeles. Jim shook his head and smiled. This was a vista he hadn't seen since he took up climbing while in high school. It would have been pleasant to sit down on the hilltop, as he'd done so many times before, and watch the stars come out one by one through the haze. but he wanted to find his people. Downhill will probably work as well as anything else, he thought, and took a step. And the suit creaked around him as Jim half slid, half bounced down through the red dust and gravel of the slope inside the crater's rim to where the other suited figure stood, hands on hips, gazing upward. The other suit was fleet issue too, with commander's stripes on the sleeve, and and the pierced barrier and arrow of the Starfleet Corps of Engineers. Jim bounced over to Scotty's side, tapped his own faceplate as a signal for Scotty to unpolarize his. "Half a moment, Jim," Scotty said over Jim's helm intercom, pointing upward. Jim looked up and saw the reason. They were lowering the crater dome into place, a tremendous, fuller-ribbed clear steel shell that blocked out more and more of the hard black violet sky as the tractors of the Thermopylae and Telea let it down. "Lord, Scotty, that thing must be 10 kilometers wide." 11.4588, Scotty said, almost absently. His mind was very much elsewhere. Jim knew, for he could feel his old friend's concern as if it were coming from within himself, not from outside. The computers had said the thing wouldn't collapse under its own weight this time, but then they'd said that the last 2 times before Scotty had come on the job and suddenly gotten the hunch about the distribution equations for the bracing. Now they would find out the truth in the only way any engineer ever really trusted, no matter what the paperwork said. Scotty gestured at Jim, and together they bounced a little further down inside the crater wall. The dome shut out nearly all the sky above them now, and the small, ferociously white sun low down in the sky was briefly cut off, then shone again less blindingly as the clear steel polarized it. "Mind the brace, Jennifer," he said over the comm to the engineer captain of the Thermopylae. "Stop worrying and enjoy the show, Scotty." Scotty snorted. He was sweating. The dome dropped lower and lower, now hanging right above the vast double-walled support rim that had been built for it, circling the crater. It was meters above the rim, feet above it, inches. The light of the sky winked out, and still Scotty stood as still as if frozen. Even in this light gravity, the ground boomed and shuddered for seconds as the tremendous mass of the dome nested and settled into the rim. And, as it did, as all its power contacts went home, up and down the dome's bracing struts, the lights came on, glowing red, dull orange, yellow, brilliant white. People on Telea and Thermopylae were cheering. Scotty let out a long breath and turned to face Jim, his helm unpolarized now. Jim leaned over to touch helmets with Scotty, and, as he did so, was surprised. This was Montgomery Scott, all right. But where was the gray hair? Where were the wrinkles? Where had this younger man come from? "Scotty, you didn't tell me you'd done this big a job on Mars." "I haven't yet," Scotty said. "This project was still on the drawing board when my orders came in to leave for the Enterprise. I just wanted to see how it was going to come out, but I guess we'd best be looking for the others." "I suppose so," Jim said. Together, under the dazzling lights of the dome, they headed down the slope of the crater wall. They found Uhura singing in a little downstairs nightclub on Antares, too, and Sulu leaning over the rail of one of the terraces on the 10,000-step stair on the third moon of Murphak 11, admiring the view of the methane glacier, and Janice Rand standing in a pine forest with a covered picnic basket over one arm and a bemused look on her face, while a wolf she'd been talking to when they arrived slipped off into the shadows. Every few steps, Jim and his little escort would find another crewman or 3, and then walk on a little way more, and the environment would melt away into another one more marvelous or strange than the last. Wide plains of waist-high bluegrass, cinnamon-scented and blindingly jeweled with dew under a white-hot sun, became a summer evening, roofed over with a single burning spiral arm of the galaxy, floored with an endless waste of black sand and echoing with the roars of unknown beasts. A road of white glass, stretching toward a distant desolation of barren peaks, turned into a greensward. Greensward? A road of white glass, stretching away toward a distant desolation of barren peaks, turned into a greensward, rolling down in gentle hills into the sea. Gulls wheeled and cried about the pinnacles of a great many towered castle that rose on a little peninsula there, the castle's crystal windows reflecting the sunset at their backs and shining like a star. Dusty golden afternoons, pale days that held the silver sun captive in cloud above alien trees, seven-starred mornings without a shadow, glowing green dawns. They replaced one another in never-repeating procession. Not sure what else to do, Jim walked onward through them, and his people followed him. After a time, if it could be called that, for even moments past felt like now, and Jim knew that time was not really passing, he was walking along with about half the complement of the Enterprise and picking up more every few minutes. Jim was fascinated by the people themselves as by the places where he found them. Jim was as fascinated by the people themselves as by the places where he found them. Many looked younger than they had when the mission started, or else simply better, healthier, more powerful, more alive. Also, each time the environment changed and more crew people turned up, Jim found himself experiencing the newfound world, not just from his own viewpoint, with his own emotions and reactions, but from the perspective of one or more of the people he found there. The effect was like double vision, but non-visual, and for quite a while Jim found it profoundly disturbing. Is this what Spock has to put up with when he's aboard ship? No wonder he has to withdraw sometimes. There were other matters, though, also demanding attention. Jim noticed that no matter how the landscape shifted, they tended to find themselves going either uphill or down. Level stretches there were, but they were rare. He mentioned this to Scotty as they made their way up one more hillside, this one with what appeared to be a walled garden at the top of it. "Oh, aye," Scotty said. "I'd noticed that myself. I suspect it might have to do with the changes in the entropy gradient hereabouts, so that we're perceiving the waves of entropy and entropy as ups and downs. Then, maybe if we find ourselves going uphill more and more, it should mean we're getting closer to the core of the anomaly, the source of the anentropia. Aye. Then Catullus can do our bit, whatever that may be." "I haven't seen her." "Ha!" Scotty said with a grin, and pointed up the hill. The garden wall had a gate in it, and out through the gate came Catullus, along with several crew people who were munching on fruit from the trees whose branches overhung the garden wall. "So, lass," Scotty said as she came down toward him and Jim and the great crowd of the Enterprise crew. "Where to now?" She glanced up the hillside. "Farther up," she chimed, "though we may have to go farther down to get there. Captain, are you well? Is the lack of time distressing you, or all this climbing? You look troubled." Jim shook his head. No problems with the time. No problems with the time. I've had a lot of practice getting used to that lately. And the climbing? No, not even slightly, which is odd, if you call anything here more odd than anything else." He looked around him and kept on walking. "I'd like to find Spock, though. And I haven't seen Bones, either." He didn't have time to take the expected few steps down the slope of the garden hill before things shifted again. The landscape this time was fierce, harsh, craggy, all stones and sand and cracked crimson earth. A hot wind, laden with strange scents, rich and aromatic and sharp all at once, blew across rising land from a red dun sky, while a huge orange moon, terrifyingly close, swam up from beneath the high horizon, gibbous under a furious blue-white sun. Vulcan, Jim thought, and wasn't surprised at the sight of the tall form walking up the slope toward them. For one thing, as soon as this place had appeared, he'd caught the distinctive tenor of Spock's thoughts, the silent love and longing the half-Vulcan felt for this savage and desolate beauty, interwoven with the incessant activity of the man's mind as it worked to analyze the present situation. For another, Jim thought of how quickly Catullus had appeared when Scotty said he wanted to see her, and suspected strongly that, despite Spock's disclaimer, the things you wished for did happen in this place. What Jim hadn't expected was McCoy walking up the slope alongside Spock and looking around him with such a still, reserved look he seemed Vulcan himself. They came up to him and the group walking in the lead of the Enterprise crew. Experimentally, Jim groped around for the feel of McCoy's mind. It was more difficult to pin down, subtler, though no less complex, geared to receiving, in contrast to Spock's orientation toward giving, as if Spock was a light source, but McCoy was a mirror. Well, that's not quite it, but you can see other people in him. The mirror reflected Spock's bright, cool fire, and the curiosity and perplexity and delight of the crewmen all around. It even reflected Jim's own feelings, his desire to get to the heart of this mystery, his own fascination with what was going on. The perceptions were peculiar, but considering what Jim knew about Bones, they made perfect sense. Is this telepathy? No wonder Spock has so much trouble explaining it to us. Comparisons, regular words, don't adequately describe it. Yes, Captain, Spock said. It's a supremely subjective experience. Are you well? Quite. Gentlemen, I'm glad to see you. I think we're just about all here now. The only question being, where is it we are? They began to walk again. Spock fell in on Jim's right side, McCoy at his left. We are in the ship, Captain, Spock said. How should we have left it, after all? Spock, Jim said, if this is the Enterprise, Harb Tanzer's been putting a lot of extra equipment in the rec room that he hasn't told me about. Nonetheless, we are aboard the Enterprise, Captain, Spock said. What has shifted is the way in which we are perceiving her. And in those shifted perceptions, there's room for anything, just as you can imagine the whole galaxy without having to be physically large enough to contain it. We've reached the anomaly, then? Its outermost fringes, I would say. My tricorder, or the artifact of thought that is presently manifesting as my tricorder, indicates the entropy gradient increasing toward the high ground. That is the way we must keep going. As usual, Bones muttered. Which brings me to another question. Bones, people are looking a lot better. McCoy nodded. So I see. The answer is straightforward enough, if the way we're going is really toward an area of decreased entropy. Aging, trauma, physical death are all functions of heat death, ultimate energy loss. So traumas of the mind, and if that's being halted or reversed, it's no wonder people look better. The mind affects the body. It can't be otherwise. What I'm not sure of is how far the effect will go, but I suspect it'll continue to accelerate as we approach the heart of all this. I tell you, it worries me a little. No need, Doctor, Spock said. Indeed, you will not be worrying about it much longer, if my theory is correct. As we head further into the region of anentropia, entropic aspects of behavior, anger, fear, and so forth, will rapidly decrease, even disappear. Are you saying we're going to become less human than we are? Spock sighed and looked at McCoy with nearly an unalloyed affection. Leonard, please stop disagreeing just to have something to say. McCoy's mouth fell open. If you are truly going to sorrow to see your fellow crew people lose greed, rage, terror, anguish, and the other darker emotions that beset most of the humanities, you are not who I thought you were. And I suspect we must make our peace with who we are as quickly as we can. In this place, where nothing else remains stable, that is information we will probably need to succeed in this mission. Let's get on with it, then. Uphill? Uphill, Captain. They went. Despite the strangeness of it all, Jim found the going pleasant, especially since the one sensation that frequently got lost for him during a mission was the feeling that it wasn't just him acting alone at the center of the bridge, but a whole crew doing so in concert. Having the 438 actually physically around him, if any of this was either actual or physical, was a joy. If there was a problem, it was that the changes of environment began to become irregular, unpredictable. Worlds began to shift, not with the melting grace he'd become used to, but spasmodically. Images tore, whirled, jumbled together. He glanced to his right. Trouble, Spock? Spock lifted his tricorder, studied it. Very likely. We are entering an area of turbulence in the entropy mix. The tricorder readings are chaotic, but I suspect that beyond the turbulence lies an area in which the gradient of anentropia increases very sharply indeed. We are coming close to the core of the anomaly, Captain. All right, Jim said, and turned to face the 400 who followed. We're almost there. We're almost where we're going, but we're in for some rough stuff, he said, and then had to stop talking for a moment. He hadn't looked back at his crew for a while. This place, however, had not stopped working on them. They looked so young, so strong, so capable and powerful that he wondered for a moment why he was bothering to warn them about anything. It was strange to have said for all these years, I have the best crew in the fleet, and to suddenly not just know, but see that was true. Jim was, in fact, a little abashed to be standing in front of them. They were so splendid. But they looked at him with their usual calm acceptance of whatever he had to say. So Jim found his nerve again and went on. Stay together. Keep an eye on the people around you. Don't lose anyone. Mr. Spock tells me we're going to have some pretty steep ground ahead. He didn't even need their murmur of acquiescence. The wave of their thought, agreement, support, a willingness to follow wherever he led, hit Jim so hard he thought he would fall down. Let's go then, he said, and turned to rejoin his bridge crew and led the way. For the first time, climbing started to become difficult, as if gravity had reasserted itself, then had become stronger and stronger, building to several times Earth normal. Jim struggled up through it, while around him the scenery changed more and more swiftly, swirling around him in an increasingly disorienting storm of instability. It was as if the world were coming apart. His body felt as if it were being torn and tugged in many directions. Jim! Someone gasped by his side. He looked over at McCoy. The kid's in back, Bones said. Jim looked over his shoulder. The storm of imagery almost hit his crew, most of whom were walking heads down, struggling into the tempest. The air's a little clearer here, Jim said. That's what I meant. They need us, their officers, to be with them. They're worried about us, and it's making the going harder for them. We'll split up then. He glanced around him at the bridge crew, many of whom were close by. Everybody find a group to take care of. Bones, send some of the kids in the middle up to be with me. McCoy patted Jim on the shoulder, vanished into the howling maelstrom. Jim gathered his group of 30 or 40 about him, took a few steps to determine which way uphill was. Sight was almost no use now, and headed up the steep slope, through the whirling, tattering landscape. He was in increasing pain. His slow-growing telepathy had begun bringing him the distress of the crew people around him as their own minds and bodies were torn at, shaken. If the tearing had been merely physical, he could have borne theirs and his without too much trouble. Spock had long since taught him the simpler of the Vulcan disciplines for handling pain, by which one accepts the pain until it becomes part of one and vanishes. But this is beyond accepting, Jim thought in his own terror, as again and again his thoughts seemed to slip out from under him, becoming someone else's, and Jim Kirk got lost. What if I can't find myself again afterward? Never mind that. Just keep going. Can't hear myself think. What are all these people doing in my head? Dear Lady Mother, please just help me keep moving. I can't burden my crewmates with me. Robbie, you've got to keep up. No fearing in the past is anything like this fear. I wish I'm lying down and dying here, but I can't. I'm needed. Mary needs me. He needs me alone there, leading as I'm not alone even in this following. Keep walking, sir. I'm here, dying, but here. Terror, terror, concern. For another rage, defiance, denial, defiance, intention to follow, follow, anguish, negation, rejection, follow, follow, follow. It got worse. It couldn't get worse, and it got worse. His people's frenzied thoughts hit him and hurt him like hail, and Jim didn't dare shut them away. He knew that if he did, he would lose them. Just keep going. It has to end. The going became precipitous. The surface he walked on seemed to try to drop away from beneath his feet with every step he took, and the terror, the other's terror, filled him until he couldn't tell where his own fears left off and theirs began. Lost. I'm lost. We'll wander here forever. No. No. Feel how steep this incline is. There has to be an up somewhere on the other side of this down. Keep going. They depend on you. Keep going. Aye, lass. Mind Ensign Dabach over there. She's having a hard time. Don't know. I haven't seen him. Let's look. Hang on, Jim. This can't last much longer or get much worse, I think. Oh, God. Get that thing off, Suzanne. Jerry, take her arms. No, Tasha, don't look at that. Just keep going. Lieutenant, you must keep your eyes open to walk. Stay behind me. Where she went. But we can take care of herself if anyone can. What about Christine? Christine, get up. It can't hurt you. Don't let it. Oh, master of everything. It's all in my sweet architectrix. What do you suppose that came from, and how can I keep it away? I won't. He's not, and I will not collapse in front of all these. Doctor, not an exterminator. Pain. There is no pain there. Courage. The worst. I can't never drink that again as long as I don't give up, Jim. Keep going. We're here. We're behind. If you don't give up, we won't. Can't get worse. They're all watching. Keep on just a little. Won't die. Won't. The mortur soluta must keep going. One. Morturi must keep going. Must. Can't dare. Will not give up. Will not give up. One more step. One more. Just one more. And without warning, the terrible downward slope was all gone, and Jim opened his eyes and looked around him, astonished to find himself walking uphill again, but again, with greater ease than on any downhill side he had ever walked before. Jim paused a moment, squinting in the great light to wipe the chilly sweat off his face. His people were all around him, shaken, pale, or flushed, or contracted, or vibrating as their species dictated, but otherwise whole, and looking much better than he would have expected for people who had just been through the same repeated almost death he had experienced. A few of them, Mr. Attende from maintenance, Janice Carassis from linguistics, Larry Aladort from NavComp, reached out to touch him with hands or tentacles. He suffered the touch without complaint, grateful for one thing that he still had a body, considerate of their need for another. They seemed to be reassuring themselves of their own existence by virtue of his. Ladies and gentlemen, he said to them and the other crew people standing around them, this place can't offer anything worse than that. There were murmurs of agreement. If you're all well, he said, let's go then. Pass the word back that we're starting up. Anyone unable to continue should find Dr. McCoy and make arrangements to wait. Ready? They were, he knew, as he knew, without even having to look, that no one was remaining behind. He began walking again, then slowed almost immediately as he had a chance to look around him. Partly it was the blinding brilliance of the landscape that stopped him, though it seemed to get less blinding as he peered into it. But what he saw through the light, the actual features of the land that now held still though its features. Come on. Word feature isn't even there. It's on the previous line. Let's try this again from beginning. But what he saw through the light, the actual features of the land that now held still through its details. I swear I know how to speak. I can read too. It's okay. But what he saw through the light, the actual features of the land that now held still, though its details shifted and melted as whole landscapes had before, distressed him more than any mere brightness could. "Dear God," he said to the crew people surrounding him, "what have we got ourselves into?" Chapter 12. The gates didn't last long, and that was just as well. Jim didn't know whether he would have laughed at them or started shaking if they'd proved permanent. Great golden gates they were, ornate, resplendent, set in walls that looked like brick and shimmered like pearl, and went on and on in either direction forever. Jim glanced to his left, where Mr. Matlock stood, his mouth open, and to his right, where Amakentra from Dietary stood, shaking her emerald-scaled head and twitching her gill slits. "Do you see what I see?" said Jim.
"Sweet queen of life, I hope not,"
Amakentra said.
"Ups, there it goes."
And the gates vanished. But the three of them kept staring, feeling no relief, and behind them the rest of the crew did the same. In place of the gates, a wall of stone appeared, low enough to step over, with a terrible stillness of black sky behind it, and in the place of the wall, a river so cold that it smoked, and the stones among which it ran were rimed with ice. And in place of the river, a lintel-less doorway that reached up and up out of sight, and was full of stars, and, in place of that, a great sheer flat cliff, surely one of the legendary walls of the world, with some message written on it in letters so huge that no one could read them. The whole crew had to back up many paces before the words could be made out. A whoop of wild laughter broke out then, from somewhere way back in the ranks. Lieutenant Freeman, from Life Sciences, Jim thought. His laugh stands out even in a crowd. Freeman had even more reason for it now than usual. In red block letters, very neat, the writing on the wall said, "This side up." Unfortunately, the arrow painted beside the words pointed at the ground. The sign was upside down. "I always knew there was something fundamentally wrong with the universe," someone female said from behind Jim. "No," another voice replied as the sign vanished. "That's just paranoia. Everybody has that." The barrier changed and changed, while about it the landscape remained the same. Barren, pale stone underfoot, and a clear, sourceless brilliance all around, as if the air itself burned. Hold on. That was extraordinarily Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. No, that's just paranoia. Everybody has that. I'm pretty sure is something that Ford Prefect says to Arthur Dent in the first book of Hitchhiker's Guide. And this wall with this side up pointing down is very, very, very much a Hitchhiker's Guide thing. This is funny. Thank you very much for that, Diane. Let's get back to the story. The barrier changed and changed, while about it the landscape remained the same. Barren, pale stone underfoot, and a clear, sourceless brilliance all around, as if the air itself burned. We're seeing symbols, Jim thought. Boundary lines. Our minds are trying to warn us that we've come to the end of the world as we know it, the end of physicality, the beginning of the paraphysical. Past this line, anything can happen. Jim found himself looking at a little brook, not cold like the other one, but floored with waving weed and half choked with the sedges that climbed up its banks. He recognized it, while he was still a midshipman stationed, not stationed or any other word. While he was still a midshipman stationed on Terra, he had hunted for this spot, so that he could stand where Caesar had once stood, with the 10th Legion at his back, gazing across at Rubicon's far bank, and past it the angry might of Rome. 2 steps would take Jim across the creek. He thought of turning to one of those nearest and saying something about the die being cast, then thought better of it. Caesar had been grandstanding for his nervous legion's benefit. He had no need of such tactics with this crew. "Let's go," Jim said, and stepped down into the cold water, slipping once on the mossy stones before making the far side. His people followed him. The landscape stayed still now, barren, featureless, and level, so that Jim wasn't sure in which direction to go. On a hunch, he said to the crew people with him, "Fan out in standard search pattern and see if this light seems to get brighter in any one direction." They did, 12 of them casting about with tricorders or just with eyes. "Sir," one of the Yellerids sang back to him from 20 or 30 meters left and forward, "there is a difference here. The air seems clearer." Looking at her, Jim could see a difference, too. Despite the fact that he was farther away than the other crewmen, Ensign Nillet's sable-furred shape looked somehow closer and more distinct than the rest of them did. Her green eyes glittered as if reflecting a brighter light than surrounded Jim or any of the others. "Good work, Ensign," he said, and saw her throat pouch swell with pleasure. Not that he needed to see it. He could feel her pleasure as if it were his own. "That way, everybody." On they all went, Jim more or less at point with a few of the crew scouting ahead of him in the direction he'd indicated, more of them flanking him on either side. The air got swiftly clearer as they went along. At least, that was the least inaccurate way the effect could be described. What one saw grew sharper, colors grew more vivid, and detail richer, finer, more complex. The air itself became sharper to breathe, even a little painful at first, then a growing pleasure as one became more sensitive to a clean crispness like that on a mountain height. As one became more sensitive to a clean crispness like that on a mountain height. I don't know how to say this. I know how I want to say it. Like that on a mountain height. Like the one you find on a mountain height. It's just hard for me to... Why can't I say it? I know how to say it. It just doesn't feel natural. Sorry, I want to read. I'm getting caught up in the words. But this wasn't cold. It was a delight just to walk, to breathe, to look at other people as their vividness increased. Jim did a lot of looking and began to notice something new. The crew people about him were beginning to change. The changes weren't always immediately obvious, and there was nothing terrible about them. It was as if the things Jim saw had always been latent in his people somehow, waiting to come out, but the transformations were no less strange for that. Some of the crew people abruptly lost all resemblance to their usual selves. Some kept their bodies, but there was something bizarre or new or wonderful about them that Jim had never noticed before. Some seemed completely unchanged in form, but picked up odd companions. Jim let his own pace slow a little, out of sheer amazement. There was Lieutenant Brand, a slender, little, dark-haired woman with a pert, pretty face, one of the designer engineers from down in Phaser Tech, walking alertly along with one hand on her sidearm, and her other hand held by a giant rabbit that was walking on its hind legs beside her. There was Mr. Mosley from down in stores. One moment he was fine, but a breath later Jim found himself looking at an Andorian alicorn that paced calmly along on 6 delicate hooves, and paused once to polish its indigo horn against the creamy pelt of one flank. Janice Carassus from linguistics went by, arguing and laughing in many tongues with the crowd of hominid and non-hominid sentients surrounding her, proud-faced people with indigo skins and big lithe felinids, and fierce-eyed black-robed folk with veiled faces. Tall and stoop-shouldered Lieutenant Freeman from Bio, walking to one side, noticed Kirk looking toward him, and waggled a small grave salute at him to let his captain know he was being taken care of. But in the middle of the gesture things became otherwise, and Freeman's life sciences white was changed to the dark, somber splendor of old 20th century dress. He was suddenly taller, slimmer, and inhumanly handsome. In the hand that had held his tricorder, Freeman now bore a rose that burned silver as a sun. That kind of thing by itself would have been enough to make Jim glance away. He felt sure that this vision, like the others he was seeing, was a physical expression of some profound personal truth, something very private. However, there were also mildly disturbing aspects to some of the images he saw. For instance, Jim had never been completely comfortable with furry things since the problem with the dribbles. So maybe that was why the great shaggy-pelted pink caterpillar alien flowing along behind Freeman, tugging at his clothes with cruelly clawed arms and begging him for dessert, made Jim so uneasy. Unnerved, he turned his eyes to McCoy's little contingent for reassurance. Most of them looked normal. Uhura was walking with that group. She seemed unchanged, but she was accompanied by a huge crowd of animals from many planets that went striding, thundering, hopping, and slithering along with her while she held earnest conversation with one or another of them. Leah Burke was there, too, near the front of the group, herself unchanged, though there was a darkness about her, as if some huge creature Jim couldn't see was following Leah closely, and she walked in its shadow. And McCoy. The doctor saw Jim's stunned look, spoke a word or two to a couple of the people who were keeping him company, and left them behind to see Kirk. Jim literally had to squeeze his eyes shut as Bones approached. McCoy blazed, not with light, but with an intense compassion that could be felt on the skin, even from a distance, like sun in a desert. Jim had always known Bones cared deeply about people, but he was unprepared for the full truth of the matter. This passionate alliance to life, this fierce charity that wished health and joy to everything that lived. Jim felt all the death in him, all the entropy screaming and cowering away. It knew its enemy. It tried to drag Jim away with it, but he stood his ground, wondering whether he would survive McCoy's touch, or be able to stand the burning life it promised if he did. "Jim, you all right?" the familiar voice said, as a hand took him by the arm, the fingers surreptitiously on the inside of the arm to find the brachial artery for the pulse. "Never better," Jim said, and gasped, too shocked to say anything else for a moment or open his eyes. Strangely, it was true. The casual touch of McCoy's hand had staggered him like a graze from a phaser set on kill. But now he was feeling almost more alive than he could bear, and moment by moment the aliveness became more bearable. He tried to hide his need to gulp for air, then gave it up and just gulped, hoping his friend would simply think he was winded from the long walk. Hidden natures are getting loose, Jim thought. What we conceal doesn't stay that way here. It may be this isn't going to be a good place to stay for very long. Or, well, good, but not safe. "Just let yourself breathe. It'll pass," McCoy said, sounding slightly abashed. "Sorry. I keep forgetting, and that keeps happening." Jim opened his eyes and found McCoy easier to look at, though no less bright with compassion. Bones let Jim go, then glanced down with wry amusement at the hand that had both steadied and unsteadied his captain. "I want people to be better," he said with some wonder, "and they get that way. Dangerous stuff." "That armor getting heavy?" Bones said, sounding a bit tentative now. Jim shook his head, thinking, "What armor? What's he seeing?" "No problem," he said. "Bones, have you been noticing people?" McCoy looked away, nodding. "More than people," he said. "If this crew wasn't comfortable with itself before, it will be now. But Jim, have you seen—" "Captain," the other familiar voice said on his other side, "are you well?" And Jim turned to look at Spock and was dazzled again, but this time he couldn't look away. Spock hadn't changed. But here his spirit showed as it never had before, even in the harrowing intimacy of mind meld. From the meld, Jim was already familiar with the incessant activity of that cool, curious mind as it tirelessly hunted answers. But now he saw where the activity came from. Spock's utter certainty that there was no higher purpose for his life than to burn it away in search of truth, and to give that truth away when he found it. More, Jim saw what fueled and underlay the certainty, a profound vulnerability paired with a great unreasonable joy. The deepest hidden parts of Spock's Earth-human heritage, both of them sheer terror to a Vulcan mind. Even when Spock had been trying to suppress or deny those hidden legacies, they had managed again and again to escape and express themselves as valor and wry humor, and the endless good-natured fencing with McCoy. But Spock wasn't denying the inheritance so vehemently anymore, and the power of the older, wiser man was a joy to behold and a terror. This great mind has been standing behind me and quietly obeying my orders for all these years. Why? He could be so much more. But in this place the answer was plain to read. Loyalty was frequently unreasonable and illogical, and Spock had long since decided that this one aspect of his life could do without logic. "Spock," Jim said, and ran out of words. He was deeply moved, and didn't know how to adequately express it, until he abruptly felt Spock feeling the emotion with him, and knew there was nothing more that needed saying on the subject. "I'm fine, Spock," he said then, and glanced over at McCoy. Bones was gazing at Spock in a curious, almost grudging calm. "Leonard," Spock said, "you are not seeing anything now that you have not long suspected was already there. Nor am I." The shadow smile, the flash of humor, pierced Spock's outer and inner sobrieties once more. "And you need not be concerned about your dark places revolting me. I have seen them before in Meld, and may yet see them there again. More apparent here is that neither of us is quite the hopeless case the other has sometimes considered him to be." "It'd help if I understood why it's apparent," McCoy said, grumbling, though it was obvious to Jim that his heart wasn't in the grumble. "I'm sure you've already come to suspect part of what is happening here, Doctor. True natures are becoming evident, and latent talents are being enhanced due to the increasing anentropic nature of the space, so I infer. Already I need not touch for mind meld, nor need you, as you just found. And probabilities are high that we shall see stranger things yet." "Speculate," Kirk said, doubting Spock would care to. "On the contrary, Captain, the boundaries between separate minds are thinning, as the Doctor suggested they might. But the result seems to be that people are becoming more themselves as a result, rather than less. The exact cause for this I cannot state with certainty. It may be a function of the nature of mind, hitherto unsuspected, or a function of this particular space. But we must do what we can to find out, for that, too, is data we may need where we are going." There was something about the phrasing that made Jim hold still and look around him at his people, who, moment by moment, were becoming more real, burning with surpassing selfness, as McCoy did with compassion and Spock did with knowing. "Which is, I take it," Jim said very slowly, "to the side of the angels?" "Idiomatic, but precise in mood, if not particulars," Spock said, as they began to walk again. "Jim, consider it a truly anentropic space, a place where energy is not lost, where time may not exist, or may be perceived as a whole rather than a sequence of events, a place where the emotions sprung from mortality and the fear of it have no foundation, no reason to exist. Where is that?" McCoy looked at Spock with an expression compounded of unease and awe and delight. "Where there shall be no more death," he said slowly, "neither sorrow nor crying, neither shall there be any pain, for the former things are passed away." Spock nodded. "The question becomes who or what we will find there, and what will be required of us. For I am becoming increasingly sure there is a need for us, something we have to do. In neither the Vulcan mythologies nor the Terran ones do mortals walk the realms of the gods without reason. There is always a task to be performed, one to which gods are unequal, and for which mortals must therefore be enlisted. So we must be ready. We must make our peace with what we find in ourselves here and in others. He looked at McCoy with his own version of the doctor's curious, wondering calm, so that we are prepared for the stranger truths ahead. He glanced at Jim. And the sooner we manage it, the better. We must not overstay our welcome. If we remain here so long that this space begins to remove the mind scars that we call our memories, we are undone. And sooner or later, even Catullus shielding will yield and give us And sooner or later, even Catullus shielding will yield and leave us frozen and unconscious for eternity, if eternity can be properly said to exist in a place without time. They walked on. The laughter of the crew people following them became less frequent, but that was not to say the crew was becoming any less merry or excited than before. Jim could feel his people's delight settling down into a kind of sober joy and expectation that found words and noises and inadequate expression. Thought worked better, and Jim could feel them exploring one another's minds with a shy and childlike excitement, beginning to weave themselves into a great whole, of which their old crew morale had been a pale foreshadowing. Some of the exploration Jim found rather familiar, except that it now sounded strangely like the ruminations of a single mind instead of a discussion between two. I'd been thinking that the system shouldn't just stop with cause. And it doesn't. There's a higher level of responsibility still, with more power attendant on it. When you're ignorant of cause, of your personal responsibility for the way the universe is, no matter how much you try to change things, they stay the same, because down at the bottom of your mind you're believing it's someone or something else's fault, that things are the way they are. But the acceptance of cause enables you to bring about true alteration, making things other, without the persistence associated with change. The acceptance makes possible the archonic functions, the ability to ordain energy states for entire universes. Read all the rest of that, or the previous paragraph in Catullus' voice. I don't want to reread. I'm going to go on. Lass, it still seems impossible to alter a universe's whole operating system just by saying you want to. But Montgomery, there was at least one person I know of on your planet who used to do such things rather routinely. He codified one of the basic rules for the art. Ask, and it shall be given unto you. An inspired creative physicist way ahead of his time. Anyway, the rest of the system is simple. Extropy, entropy, and anthropy are the three energy states in this paradigm. There are probably more in higher dimensions, as with all the other relationships. Entropic universes you know about. They start out with a fixed amount of energy and lose it. Extropic systems can be generated by ordnance, but generally no one bothers. They're sterile, sealed systems that don't lose energy and therefore rarely produce life unless something punctures them. And anthropic systems are eternally and undying. Universes capable of reproducing themselves by generating new energy to replace the old. By taking it from somewhere else. By creating it out of nothing. Magic again. Or steady state. Oh no, there's more voices in here. Aye, lad. See, though, once you've ordained an energy state for it to exist in, matter can exist as bound energy rather than mere dead illum floating in the sterile void, and it all starts again with length and width and depth, and around we go. I'm confused. Who the bloody hell is talking where? I need at least one, Scotty said, in that mess. Let's back it up. I'm going to do it all again. So I think that Catullus is bouncing some Scottish brogue back at Scotty with the eye lad. Unless there's a boy that's mysteriously been inserted. I don't know what to do. It seems so simple on the surface. It's simple all the way down. You're just used to things being confusing, that's all. Jim sighed, considering that he must be used to that too, and kept walking with his crew. As they all went, the surroundings were becoming increasingly featureless. It might have been a smooth white floor they all walked on, and the burning in the air grew brighter until every feature of every crewman showed with terrible and splendid distinctness. Uniforms blazed and glittered like royal raiment, and faces were so bright they seared the eyes. "You're glowing," Bones said to Jim, almost accusingly. "I am not," Jim said, because he didn't want to be. More because he didn't want to be than because he wasn't. "That is, though," he pointed ahead. Perhaps 100 meters in front of them, the distance was difficult to judge without reference points. Everything, even the floor, vanished in a brilliance the eyes could not pierce, a place where the burning of the air increased by many orders of magnitude. It was not precisely light, but it was hard to think what else to call it. The zone of brilliance reached off to both sides, and upward and downward beyond the limits of sight. Jim stood still, just looking at it for a moment, and the hair stood up on the back of his neck. He couldn't tell why. "Spock," he said. Spock glanced down at his tricorder and shook his head. "Total instrument failure," he said, and then was very surprised indeed to see the tricorder quietly reduced itself to gray plastic and screws and bits of wire, all of which slipped through his fingers and fell to the floor, through it, and out of sight. "Now ask me why I don't like working with machines," McCoy said. "Doctor, please." Spock looked up, dusting his hands off. "One simply must be careful what one says in this space. It is likely to come literally true. This is the core of the anomaly, and apparently a very malleable place." "Good," Jim said. "Maybe we won't have too much trouble patching the rift between the spaces. Where are Catullus and Scotty?" "Here, sir," Catullus said from Jim's other side, where she and Scotty had not been a moment before. "But, Captain, we have a problem." "Captain," said another voice from behind them. He turned to see Amakentra there, blinking her great wet eyes at him. All her thoracic scales were pale with distress. It was the first pain Jim had seen in some time, and it came as a shock. "Ensign, what's the matter?" "Captain," she said, "I almost died once when the Klingons attacked the Yorkton years back. This," she gestured with her iridescent scalp membrane at the brilliance, "was what I saw when I died on the table, before they brought me back, before I was sent back. But this isn't," she broke off, searching for words. "Sir, what I saw me, talked to me, asked me whether I was finished with life. But this has its back turned. It won't answer." Jim thought of that quick chill up his neck. He turned to the crew, who had moved up to surround him in a great semicircle. "Anyone else notice something like that?" he said. The answer didn't come back in words, which was just as well, for it would have taken too long. People on starship duty frequently got into deadly situations, and many of Jim's crew had had out-of-body or paradeath experiences. Not all of them were alike. The non-hominid species, especially those to whom sight was not their most important sense, reported apotheoses of smell or sound, or assaults of flavor or physical sensation as dazzling as the traditional white light was to a hominid. But all of the crew people who poured their answers into Jim's mind agreed that what they now saw or felt or tasted was like what they had experienced before, except that it was ignoring them. "Captain," Catullus said, "I was about to tell you that this brightness was the most physical manifestation of a great life source, which complicates matters. We can't just start tampering with this place. We can't just start tampering with this space without at least establishing communication and warning the being or beings of what we're about to do. so it or they can do what's necessary for protection. Jim nodded. How? Catullus laughed at him, a sound like a music box telling a joke. Captain, the way I'm speaking to you may work very well. I haven't had to speak basic since we all came into this place. The mere intention to communicate seems to overcome the barriers of language and species. If we tell that what we're about, it should hear us. She turned toward the great brilliance, and in a clear, quick arpeggio sang out, We're friends. Will you talk to us? Jim wasn't sure what he was expecting, but he was disappointed when nothing happened at all. Maybe you weren't loud enough, he said. Catullus jangled. I doubt that's the problem, she said. Maybe someone else is needed, or more people. They tried both those options. They tried Spock's grave, calm speech in both Basic and Vulcan, and Scotty's brogue, and Chekhov's melodic, tense-ridden Russian. Uhura tried a couple of sentences in Hestva and Yelaru, and then quit, looking dubious. Janus Carassus tried Vercingetorix and Shalast and De Sekeda with no more success. After McCoy lost his patience and shouted at the brightness in amiable annoyance, many other crew people tried shouting and waving their arms. Then they tried speaking in groups. Then Scotty suggested that the whole crew give up vocal speech and try thinking very hard, all in concert. The resultant thundering chorus of thought nearly deafened Jim inside, but the brilliance didn't waver as much as a candle flame's worth. Annoyed, Jim turned around to find Uhura looking at the great brightness with a smile that was a little amused, a little rueful. Well, he said to her, any ideas? She glanced over at him. You feel an existence there, don't you? A life? Certainly. His neck hair stood up again as he said it, and this time Jim knew why. There might be no weighing lives one against another, but he could feel to the core of him that this life was somehow immeasurably bigger than his. So? I'm not sure, but we may be erring in our presupposition that this, she gestured at the light, is at as complex a stage of development as we are, at least as far as communication goes. We may be far ahead of it in some ways. I don't see how. The power coming from that. Power isn't everything, Captain. What do you need to communicate? Common language? No, we seem to be doing without that, don't we? The desire to communicate, then? True enough. But you need it on both sides. Are you saying that this doesn't want to communicate with us? It might not even be anything that complex. Say that you're going to start from scratch and invent communication. What do you need first? Jim looked at her, thinking. Not just the ability or the desire, and it occurred to him. The concept of communication itself? Uhura grinned at him, delighted with the aptness of her pupil. You do need that, sir. But remember, though, you're inventing communication. There's one thing that precedes inventing the concept. Jim thought for a while, then shook his head. Tell me. It's easy to miss, the way a fish misses water. To invent something, you have to have invented inventing first. Otherwise, you're stuck. Uhura grinned more broadly at Jim's puzzled look. If you think it's impossible to do something about a situation, you never do it, do you? The possibility literally never occurs to you, so neither does the solution. Captain, what if this existence in front of us has not only never invented the notion of communication, but it's never invented inventing either? What if it doesn't communicate with us because it not only doesn't know that there's such a thing as communication, but it doesn't know that there's anything or anyone else to communicate with? What if it doesn't even know it's there? Jim took a long breath, for it made a kind of peculiar Spock, who nodded and spoke to Uhura. You are suggesting, then, that the only way to communicate with it is to first teach it Inventing? Creation, so that it becomes able to grasp its own presence. And then ours?
That's right.
Interesting. Okay.
And then ours.
And then ours.
That's right.
McCoy, standing beside Spock, looked uneasy again. You're talking about teaching it self-awareness. That's dangerous business. Remember what happened with the first holographic analog computers before the designers got them to generate their own senses of purpose, of fulfillment. Destructive behavior is just as unlikely in fully human minds, Doctor, even after thousands of years of thinking about the subject, Spock said. It is always a being's own choice what it will do with its mind once it discovers it has one. Be mastered by it, and become a tool of entropy, or master it, and turn away from destruction. We have some skill in that art among various members of this crew, yourself certainly included. He looked at Uhura again. Physical communication, as far as that phrase has meaning in this space, does not seem to be working. I am willing to contribute the mind meld part of this experiment, Lieutenant, if you desire it.
With the captain's permission, I do.
Jim nodded, not seeing any clearer solution. There's another problem, Spock, McCoy said. There's no time here, no succession, no duration. You need that for thought. How are you going to get through to this big bright whatever with time-based thought concepts?
Maybe through me, sir,
said a throaty voice from behind McCoy. Ensign Dehenish stepped out, his fur shining silken and blazing silvery gold in reflection of the nearby brilliance.
I'm used to living in now. I don't have was or will be.
He said the words as if they were from some strange foreign language.
But neither does this, if I understand Lieutenant Uhura.
Danish flicked his ears toward the brightness.
And I do have then, which it needs to understand us or time-binding at all. I think I'm the bridge Mr. Spock and Ms. Uhura will need.
Jim looked at the Sadrau, then at McCoy. Bones? McCoy nodded, though reluctantly. Captain, he's probably right, but this whole thing is dangerous. It could cost all three of them their minds. He made a helpless gesture. Not that we have any choice. We can't very well just take the chance of killing this poor trillion-watt what's-it in the name of saving the universe. It has a right to live, too. Go, Jim said to Dehenish. The Illyrian went to join Spock and Uhura, who were already talking quietly together, preparing for the meld. Jim said a word or two to Dehenish, and the three of them drew close. Jim waited for the conventional touching of nerve pressure points on the face that Spock usually used with the meld. But it seemed that here Spock didn't consider it necessary. He simply gathered the other two in with his eyes. Nyota, he said. Reniwa. Be with me. A great stillness spread outward from them to the crew until it seemed all 400 people were holding their breaths at once. Uhura lifted up her head, eyes closed, and whispered something. Spock's lips, Dehenish's jaw, mirrored the movement. The air began to prickle with an unbearable sense of something about to happen, the lightning about to strike. The anticipation built and built, became as fierce a burning as the sourceless fire in the air. Jim wanted to move, to shout, anything to break the tension, but he was frozen still, caught in the sudden power of the meld with all the rest of the crew, trapped in Dehenish's eternal now, in Uhura's insistence that whatever heard her create not only time and existence, but creation itself, in Spock's relentless embrace of mind that gathered everything in and made it one. The tension built, the power grew and grew. Uhura's eyes snapped open in terror. 3 cries shattered the stillness in anguished unison. Hers, Spock's. A terrible screaming yowl from Danish. The 3 of them fell sprawling together, as if the same hand struck them down. The unwavering brilliance rippled, then streamed and buckled like a storm-blown curtain, then tore, and all hell broke loose. There we go. That was a good chunk of pages. End of chapter 12. So I managed to blow through 31 pages. And with that, that means that I'm probably going to finish in the next 2 days, because there's about 53 more pages left, plus the bibliography, which I've already glanced at once. Feels good. Fun, easy read. So chapter 13, lucky chapter 13. I wonder if we've left the Enterprise crew's final running out of luck for that chapter, or if it's just another chapter like all the rest of them. Superstition be damned. Have yourselves a good night.